Hi, I'm Julia Hollander, and this is my Saga Spaces talk.
Hello and welcome to Saga Spaces, your brand new online community. This is a space you can attend fun and informative classes, read insightful articles, and soak up new and enriching information from our experts, all from the comfort of your own home. It's a tailored space specifically designed with you in mind. I'm Maxine Mawhinney and I'm delighted to be your presenter for this afternoon's fully interactive live talk. Today I'm joined by writer, researcher and singer Julia Hollander. As an opera director and choral singer, Julia was the first woman ever to stage a show at the London Coliseum, and more recently has designed singing programmes for people with conditions such as Parkinson's, long COVID, and even dementia. Today, Julia will share with us her insights into the transformative power of music. Drawing on her own research and experience, she will examine the health benefits of singing. And after her talk, of course, there'll be a Q&A for you, so don't forget to submit your questions. Hi, Julia. Welcome to Saga Spaces, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, Maxine. Lovely to be here.
Now, before you start, Julia, tell us a bit about your latest book. It's called Why We Sing. Now, what's it about, and why did you write it?
So, Why We Sing is a series of stories that take you from the cradle to the grave about singing, about my experiences of singing and my friends and family and many singers that I've known through my life. And I've knitted together these stories around the science, the current science, both behavioural science and neurology and other broader things, maybe a bit about development in children, a bit about evolution, a bit about anthropology. These things have all come together to just prove to us that singing is a completely natural phenomenon and part of what it is to be a human. So I took time out, as so many people did, in lockdown. And I sat in front of my computer and I committed my brain to scientific research. I read these papers, the latest papers that have come out of institutes all over the world, actually. And it was totally fascinating. And that's how I then came to write this book, where I take you from the very first experiences of listening to song in the womb up until funerals.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this because, Julia, I was told at school that I couldn't sing, and if I wanted to join the choir, I had to mime. So I've been scarred for life, and I'm hoping that your talk's going to maybe enthuse me into going back to singing. But first, let's remind our audience, all of these talks are live and fully interactive. So you can leave your comments, you can ask Julia a question, or even just tap an emoji to let us know how you're feeling. But let's get on with this, and let's go back. I'm going to hand you over to Julia Hollander for your Saga Spaces talk. Why We Sing, a celebration of the healing power of song. Julia.
Summertime and the living is easy. Fish are jumping and the cotton is high. That's probably a song you know. And it's a song that's more covered than any other song ever in the history of recording of song. It comes from Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. I sing it in jazz gigs, and it's also requested there a lot. But I sang it a good 20 years ago now to my babies. And it's with babies I want to start. I talked in the introduction about how we hear song in the womb. And that's a really fascinating thing, because the human embryo develops inside the womb, inside the amniotic fluid, underwater, and it develops the hearing, the listening part of its brain very, very early on in the first trimester. So it can hear what's going on through the amniotic fluid. And the thing it becomes most familiar with is its mother's voice. Now imagine your mother's voice a bit like whale song. So it's a flow of sound, a flow of tonality, without the kind of percussive effects of consonants, without the beginnings and ends of words necessarily, but just this tonal tune that comes to you down in the womb. That's the first thing you hear, and you become familiar with it through those months in the womb. When you come out, you hear that voice in a slightly different form, and you hear that voice doing this singy-songy thing that parents do that behavioural scientists call infant-directed speech, which is basically, that sort of baby singy-songy thing, hi baby, that babies love. The reason they love it is because they've heard it before. They've heard a more extreme and melodic version of their parents' voices when they were in the womb. So they get it. And they also get how to imitate what we're doing. So they develop babble. And babble, of course, is that kind of incoherent, exaggerated, tonal, singy-songy thing that babies do. Now, what's interesting about that, when behavioural scientists get hold of these recordings of baby babble, is that actually babies imitate the tonality of their parents' voices very, very soon. When they're very, very young, they'll be starting to listen to exactly the tonal patterns of a sentence, like the sentences I'm speaking to you now. They start to imitate them, probably in a more exaggerated way, with their little voices. And the way that they learn words then, maybe a year later, is to slot into that melodic form the actual structure of words with their beginnings and ends. So basically, you could think of the development of a child as the process from singer to speaker. And there's a lot of science behind that. There's also some science that says that we as humans, as hominids, sang long before we spoke. So millennia ago, when we were Neanderthals, for example, we were also using a sort of babble language without words in it, but we were highly expressive. We could express our emotions, we could express abstract ideas, high and low, wide and narrow, and we communicated really, really well through song. Now, that's the beginning of life, the baby bit. Fast forward to the end of life, and you've also got language and song meeting. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my work with people with dementia. My work with people with dementia started about 10 years ago, when I used to go along as an entertainer to day centres. And I was there, here comes another bit of singing. That certain night, the night we met, there was magic abroad in the air. There were angels dining at the Ritz, and a nightingale sang in Berkeley Square. Okay, I was singing away, and a lot of the people in my audience were nodding off. Because they have dementia and they're on a serious medication, and because it's the slot after lunch and all they want is a snooze. And I was thinking, well, my voice is like a kind of vocal hug. It's my way of touching them. And I don't say this lightly, actually. If you think of the words we use for singing and listening to singing, we talk about being moved by a song or being touched by a song. And literally, musical sound, especially the sound coming from a human body, is sound waves. It's waves of motion moving through the air and entering your body, or even touching your skin, touching your hair. We feel sound. And there's a quotation I really like on this one, which comes from the percussionist Evelyn Glennie, who's deaf. And she plays barefoot. She plays with huge orchestras, and she senses the sound that they're making and what sound she wants to make with her percussion instruments through the soles of her feet. And she talks about sound as a form of touch. That's what she calls it, a form of touch. So I was thinking that as I was singing away for these people with dementia. A vocal hug, I was thinking. And then I was thinking, well, the way to stop them going to sleep and this feeling of kind of disconnection of me being here and them being there would be for them to join in. I would much prefer that we were all having a hug together. So that's what I started doing. I met some music therapists. I got some training in singing therapy, and I basically developed my sing-along repertoire, which wasn't so hard, it turned out, because I was at primary school in the 70s, and in the 70s, there were a lot of sing-along events would happen at primary school. And I knew amazing amounts of music hall numbers, folk songs, early Beatles, stuff that people in their 70s and 80s suffering from dementia learnt when they were in their teens. And that's the significant time when we kind of embed music. So behavioral scientists say that between around 13 and 25 in adolescence is this really, really vital time when all the music that we hear, often, it's teenage music, it's rock and roll or what it might have been in your adolescence. It embeds. It's something that we recall our whole lives. And for people with dementia, that's really, really important. So I'll come back to that later. I just want to give you an example of the kind of miracles that I started experiencing in those dementia singing groups when people came and actually participated. So there was this chap called Ron, and he'd been an accountant, and he was brought along by his wife, not because he liked singing or even liked music, according to her. It was because she liked it. She liked it, and she wanted something to do together. So they used to turn up, and Ron was really affable and not really very verbal. She said he didn't speak much any longer. But he was really fascinated by the percussion, particularly the beat of my guitar playing. He used to watch my hands. And I gave him a tambourine. And according to his wife, he'd never played any instrument, not even percussion. So this was quite a big thing. And he immediately started beating it against his thigh on the beat, perfectly on the beat. In fact, he was leading the beat for the group of the song that we were doing. So I was really fascinated by that. I actually ended up handing over the guitar and showing him some chord shapes. And again, he really loved doing that. And we got him with some really, really simple chords accompanying the group. So he went from not being a musician at all to being a musician, kind of because of the dementia. Because of the dementia, because he was brought along by his wife, but also because his form of dementia had loosened his inhibitions. He'd become a less inhibited and self-conscious person. And that's a kind of vital element in all participation, especially of music. And although dementia, of course, is a devastating disease, and people whose loved ones are suffering from it see how much they've lost in terms of personality and understanding and often memory, of course. Their personality has completely altered. But one thing they might gain is actually this loss of inhibition. And for me, when I haven't known those people in their previous guise, the previous person they were, it's actually a really joyful, wonderful thing to be able to participate in music with them. And it gives them huge confidence. And sometimes it gives them back things they've lost, like language. So I want to talk a bit more about this language and singing thing. I'm going to just check what I said, because there's Ron, who I feel so fond of. I'm going to move on to Peg. I think that's where I am. I'm at Peg already. So yeah, the thing about Peg, she couldn't speak at all. She would kind of, it wasn't even babble. It was a garbled, quite distressing, sort of sign of anxiety when she verbalized. She tended not to. But we discovered really early on that she was really good at singing Patsy Cline's Crazy. I'm going to try this for you. It's not one of my repertoire, but she sang it amazingly, Peg. It went like this. You probably know it. Crazy. I'm crazy for feeling so lonely. Crazy. I'm crazy for feeling so blue. She knew all the words. She performed it. The whole group were completely silent as she performed it. It turned out that every time she came along to the group, she would perform Crazy. She knew lots of other songs too, and she would kind of improvise in the group, and she'd come up with sometimes it would be a football song, and I'd be going, oh, what are the words to that? Because she'd just sung me the tune. Other times she'd sing a whole song, lullabies, anything. And I asked her husband how come she knew so many songs and was so brilliant at rendering them. She had the most lovely voice. And he said, well, he didn't actually know, but that she'd been a housewife all her life, and she'd always had the wireless on in the kitchen. So she'd sung along. And she'd obviously sung along a lot, and these songs had embedded, and there they were. They would go home at the end of a session, and her husband would come back and say, basically, Peg was a completely different person when she got home. She was confident, she was happy, she was even capable. She could do things like she could put the kettle on. She knew where her coat was. These were things that she hadn't been able to do before she sang, but the singing had just brought back her confidence and brought back one part of her personality that was really essential. And that was so moving to see that. So, we get to my book now. My book was inspired by people like Ron and Peg. And when I started thinking about it, having written down their stories and lots of other miraculous little tales that were happening in these singing sessions, I thought, well, maybe what they're getting out of singing is the same as what we all get out of it. So I wanted to look at that. I wanted to just try and unpick what it was about singing that was so magic, but also what it was about singing that was completely everyday and known to all of us. Those of us who sing for 5 minutes in the shower. Those of us who sing to our babies, because we do. Lullabies are known throughout the world. So if you think about songs, there are a lot of different kinds of songs, right? And I try in my book not to be too specific because we all have certain tastes and certain cultural backgrounds. But for example, there are work songs. In certain cultures, there are work songs like shanties. Well, shanties were mainly sung by west coast of Britain people, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, on their way to America on the big merchant ships. So that's quite a specific cultural group, isn't it? Spirituals were sung in the plantations, in the slave fields. Only there. Now they come and they get integrated into our musical language, but a lullaby is in every single culture around the world, and every single culture has their own few lullabies, and babies recognize lullabies. They show that they do by going to sleep when they're sung them, and they recognize lullabies from other cultures. So lullabies are very particular and are sung by everybody. Just to remind you that probably if you had children, you did do a bit of singing, even if you thought you couldn't, Maxine. I don't know, we'll come to that later. So this thing about why does singing exist and why does it invigorate people and give them confidence, people like Peg. First up, you've got biomarkers. Okay, so biomarkers are the things that behavioural scientists particularly use to just gauge whether what we say about our mood is sort of biologically valid. So I say I feel better after I sing. Many people do, especially people like Peg. Well, if you take a salivary sample before and after she sings, just if she licks something and you test it for hormones, you will find that the feel-good hormones have just spiked. They've absolutely soared. The ones I'm talking about here are endorphins, endocannabinoids. Those are both thought of as analgesics. So they're feel-good in the sense that they give you less pain. If you're in pain, you have less pain. Or they might give you a feeling of being high. So they're called, the endorphins are associated with a thing called runner's high. When runners get home, they feel, whoa, a little bit heady. That's the endorphins. You get an endorphin boost. You get a dopamine boost. So you get this reward circuitry kicks in where you want to do more of it. That's dopamine. You get serotonin, which is a hormone that promotes well-being. It's actually particularly responsible for a healthy gut, but it's in SSRIs, it's in antidepressants. It's a thing that just gives us a sense of holistic well-being. That's raised by singing. Cortisol levels go down. There are other quite particular things that happen when they take blood tests. They've found that people in choirs, for example, their immune system is boosted. So you have more defense mechanism against infection at the end of a singing session. All of these biomarkers suggest the really powerful importance of singing to the individual. And there's another one that I think is probably the most important one, which is oxytocin. And that's known as the love hormone. So it's the thing that we're generating when we sing lullabies to our children, that's for sure. And apparently children, the baby, has a raised oxytocin as well as the mother. And they've done tests where they keep mothers and children apart and they put children through a stressful experience. It's children of school age, so it's children who are tested. They're given a rigorous test and it's not very pleasant for them. And then they allow half the mothers to come and give their kids a cuddle to make them feel better, de-stress them, and half the mothers to ring them up and sing them a song down the phone. And they find that oxytocin levels go up equally if you give them a hug or you sing to them. So there we are, there's the vocal hug again, and it's there in oxytocin form, in the form of the love hormone. And kind of even more brilliantly, you see oxytocin levels go up in group singing. So in a choir or any kind of group environment, say you're at a birthday party singing happy birthday, your oxytocin levels will rise because you've sung. And what that means is that we have this sense of allegiance and bonding with people that we sing with. And in certain tests, they've even shown that the oxytocin levels go up very fast, much faster than they would in any other shared experience. So say you're in a book group or a craft group or a sports team, you have a sense of bond to the other members of that team, but you don't get it as fast as you do by singing, say, one song. Which is how come, say, in a football stadium, there's a sense, even for thousands and thousands of people, of bonding with that love hormone going on. So those are the biomarkers that show that singing for sure is good for you. I wanted to just say that sense of well-being that comes from singing and sense of social bonding means that if you feel blue or you feel lonely, singing is the answer. And it's there in a lot of singers. If you think of the singers we listen to, and a particular form of singing that I love is the blues. Billie Holiday, who sang the blues amazingly, talked about it as words sugar-coated by a tune. And that's really what music does. It enables us to even experience painful things. And it's something I was thinking a lot about last week when Sinead O'Connor died, because a lot of people have said what a difficult life she had, but how she managed to actually express those difficulties and that pain through her music and through her presence on stage and through her activism and this political singing that she did. And somehow she, like Billie Holiday, brought together pain and music through song. And you could say, if you're into biomarkers, that that's because she had these feel-good hormones that enabled her to do it, or what Billie Holiday would call the sugar coating. Now, I want to go back to Peg and being able to speak because she sang. So, or being able to find words through singing. This is neurology, okay. I'm going to try and keep it really clear and simple. I'm not a neurologist, but I have done all this reading now, particularly from scientists at a place called BRAMS in Montreal, which is a laboratory where they particularly look at singing and music making and what's happening in the brain. So you can look at brain activity in two ways, essentially. These are the absolute simplest ways of looking at them. Either horizontally, from left to right, or vertically, from top to bottom. So if you look at the brain horizontally, you've got a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and they're constantly interacting. What's brilliant about this sugar coating of the tune on the words with singing is that they are separate parts of the brain. In the left hemisphere, you've got word processing. In the right hemisphere, you've got pitching and pitch processing and complex rhythm. So when you sing, if I sing, I bring together the two hemispheres. If I speak, I'm only using my left hemisphere. So that's, I think, one clue as to why someone like Peg, who's got a degeneration in her brain, might benefit from singing, because she's basically got more likelihood of more synaptic activity going on in her brain in these hemispheres. If you have a stroke, one side or the other side, you will disable whatever was going on in those in that particular hemisphere. So if you have a stroke on the left side, you lose language. If you have a stroke on the right side, you lose pitching. And this is where I'm just going to touch on this idea of being tone deaf, because a lot of people claim they are. Maxine, you might be one of them. And through all the work I've done as a singing teacher and a singing facilitator, I'm more and more certain that it's nurture, not nature. It's an environmental thing and an emotional thing, not a physiological thing. And I say this because these scientists at Brams, these neurologists, have done masses of research into tone deafness. And they have come up with this idea that, yes, there might be right side damage or right side dysfunction, and pitch processing might be the reason that someone is tone deaf. But it's only likely to be 2.5% of the population. Tiny. Whereas some huge proportion, we don't know how many, I fear in this country, really quite a large proportion of people think they're tone deaf. Why should that be? Most likely, in my experience, it's because they've got a story, and the story goes something like, I was 7 or 8, I was learning to sing at school, we had a school choir, I loved singing in the school choir, but the person running the choir asked me to be quiet, asked me to shut up, asked me to leave. Sometimes it's a family member, sometimes it's a sibling who goes, oh, you've got a horrible voice, or it's someone else in the choir who goes, shut up, you're not singing in tune, or it can even be a parent. I think it's less and less the case these days because we are a bit kinder to our children, I think, as the generations move on. But there are these teachers out there who are impatient, haven't got time, are stressed. There are less and less teachers with the skill to run choirs, actually, because it's not part of the curriculum in primary school any longer. So actually, it's a bit of a treat to be able to sing in a choir in primary school. But in our culture, it's pretty much the only time we get to sing, apart from Happy Birthday once in a while. So once you've got a culture like ours, which is basically about listening to singers, it's a consumer culture where we think of singers as professionals, right? Beyonce, the Bach Choir. Those are the people who sing, and the rest of us are listeners. We buy their music. Once you've got a culture like that, you've got no incentive to sing. So there isn't a daily practice of singing. There isn't singing going on around a meal or around a religious event. There might be singing going on at your football or even cricket, which is more and more the case, and I find that quite exciting. But generally speaking, in daily life, we're not singers any longer. So if you decide or are told at the age of 7 or 8 that you can't sing, you don't have to sing the rest of your life. And the thing about that is this idea of use it or lose it. And that's certainly the case. And the older we get, the harder it is to get something back. I say this partly because there's a lot of research now that actually says that babies, going back to babies and their babble, are born with perfect pitch. They're born able to replicate sound perfectly and be able to hear pitches very, very carefully. A bit like Pavlov's dog, they can associate a pitch with a certain food or a certain amount of light or something where you can test them that they understand pitch, that the right side of the brain is really, really functional. But unfortunately, in our culture, that's not something that develops necessarily. It has to be developed by your environment. So there you are. That's my diagnosis about tone deafness. It's probably an emotional problem, and it's something I feel very honoured to help people with. I do have people who I teach back into pitching. That's the right side of the brain, isn't it? Well, I wanted to talk a little bit. Have I got it on my page here? Yeah, going back to the right side, left side, about Ian McGilchrist. So he's a psychiatrist who has written a book called The Master and His Emissary. And in broad terms, what he's saying is that the right side of the brain is the master brain. It was the one that developed first, and it's the most holistic, it's wide-ranging, it's incredibly creative and versatile, and really, really exciting for human experience. The left side is a much more conservative kind of brain, developed later, and is strategic, he says. It likes dealing with systems, so it likes numbers and words, and I think Rishi Sunak probably likes the left side of the brain because he thinks we should all be mathematicians, doesn't he? Now, what Ian McGilchrist would say is that this left side of the brain is the emissary. It was originally created to serve the master, but what we've done is we've allowed the emissary to take over. We've allowed the left brain to become the most important part of the brain in our culture. Now, the interesting thing for a singer is you can't sing without the right side of the brain. And I think I'm going to move on into what that means about this other way of looking at the brain, the vertical way. So we've got these two hemispheres, left and right, and then we've got layers going downwards. And essentially, the simplest way of looking at it, I think, is cortex, limbic, and brainstem. Okay, 3 layers. The cortex does the thinking and the knowledge stuff. The Homo sapiens, the wisdom bit is the cortex. And it was the bit that developed latest of these 3 layers. The middle bit is the limbic brain. And the limbic brain is accessed through the right hemisphere. So right hemisphere, holistic, broad thinking, creative thinking is linked directly into our emotional thinking. Emotional meaning all the feelings that we have, but particularly the amygdala bit, which is the fight, flight, or freeze element. So if you think that the right side of the brain is the singing bit, and by the way, professionals, when they do functional MRI scanning on professional singers, they see that they're using their right side of the brain very, very fervently compared with the left. So they're using the right side and they're therefore connecting straight into the emotional part of the brain. And that's why someone like Sinead O'Connor, of course, is such an emotional singer as well, and why we associate singing with this emotional expressiveness that we all have. So there it is, there's the limbic layer, and then there's the root stem, the brain stem, which also sings. In fact, when they do these scans, they can see that some vocalizations, kind of spontaneous ones, when you go, when you smell something delicious, or when you go, ow, when you touch something that hurts. Those are spontaneous vocalizations that are processed in the brain stem. They're just there for us without us being at all aware of them, and kind of not emotionally processing them either. So this voice of ours, especially the singing voice, we think of as linked into the brainstem and the limbic system through the right side of the brain. All of which starts to make sense if you think about the most powerful singing experiences you've had. Maybe as a singer, maybe in the shower when you're just letting rip and being uninhibited like Ron, or maybe when you've listened to music and you've been incredibly moved by it. Now, I've gone on from my limbic bit back to Peg. So Peg was definitely an emotional person. And she had certain forms of memory, didn't she? Because we all do, however much the brain degenerates. And one form that they think survives more than others, certainly the listening part of the brain survives longer than any other part as we get older. But then there's this bit which is motor memory, or what we musicians call muscle memory. And that is a holistic memory as well. It's a function of the brain that's across both hemispheres and through the 3 layers. So again, someone who's got cerebral degeneration is going to have motor memory still. So the way that she remembered songs was quite possibly not really conscious. It was that thing that we do when we do something automatically. And songs do come to us like that. They literally just rise up out of us. In fact, I find remembering words, for example, it's often better to try not to think about it and just let them come as muscle memory rather than working hard at my conscious brain. Now, I'm going to finish off with some reasons why we should all be singing as much as possible, but certainly 5 minutes a day in the shower to keep us young. Okay, so those of us on the wrong side of 50, that's me, and probably you, want to keep as young as possible. And we can do it with singing. We can do it with all that feel-good factor. We can do it with aerobic exercise. Okay, singing is really, really good for your lungs. Those of us who sing are using over 50% capacity. Those of us who speak are using around 50% capacity. Those of us who just sit still are on 10% capacity, lung capacity. So 10% of your lungs used just to sit there, around 50 to speak, as I am now, up to 100% lung capacity to sing. Say you're belting something out, or you're singing an aria. If you're really singing passionately, you're Sinead O'Connor, you're going to use all your lung capacity, which is really good for you. They think of singing as equivalent in aerobic exercise terms to a brisk walk. So that's good for you. Let me see what else I've got down here. Bonding, the whole oxytocin thing means basically you can quickly gain a bond with a group of people, which when we're aging can be quite a tricky thing to do, especially when our hearing is diminishing. So as we get older, we lose the upper frequencies in our hearing. And that means often people get quite isolated because they don't want to go into big public places and socialize because it's too chaotic for their hearing. But singing is a kind of formalized form of communication, isn't it? And it's also something where we feel this oxytocin bond instantly. Also, it helps our hearing, actually. So the research that's been done in America says that even when we've had musical education as children, it will benefit our hearing in older age. But if we take up singing in our 50s or 60s, that too will really, really help our hearing brain. So there's a good reason to keep it going. I'm going to think of two more before I finish. One is facial muscles. When you're singing, you use more muscles in your face, so it keeps you more toned. So the facelift is there. Don't know. That's what they say. I hope it's so. I can't tell because I don't know what I'd look like if I didn't sing. Finally, the sound of your voice. The sound of my voice is a trained singer's voice. And the idea is that it keeps kind of mobile and young. The muscles keep fit because I do that singing regularly. And that maybe I sound younger for that. So I was going to suggest that you close your eyes and guess what age I am. What a dangerous test this is. Guess if I'm younger or older than 58. Anyway, I'm 58. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to hand back to Maxine. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your fascinating talk today. And thanks to you for watching. I hope you'll join us again soon for another Saga Spaces talk. Goodbye.